I've done the testing, I've got the results, and here they are. So in this video, I'm going to be presenting the results of the testing I've done between destroyers and cruisers to find out which ship is better, which designs work well against each other. So some of these results I found quite shocking. I actually redid a number of these tests because, well, interestingly, you'll see later on, but the destroyers performed in some interesting ways in these tests and didn't always have the results that I was expecting. So how do these tests work? Well, I'm going to be taking one type of ship design and fighting it against another type of ship design. And then I'm going to be making sure the fleets are of equal fleet strength or naval capacity. In this case, that's going to be equivalent to economic cost for those ships, so I'm not going to have to worry about that. And I'm going to be comparing the percentage of losses taken, as well as noting which side forces the other side to retreat. Now, there are really going to be a couple of types of engagement. I'm going to be having the disengage engagement type, which is what are the casualties inflicted at a point where one fleet can disengage from the combat. And then other than that, I'll be looking at the full combat and what kind of casualties we get at the end of the entire combat. As well as that, I'll be looking at what happens when war doctrines are taken into effect. Now in this case, I'm only going to be making sure that both fleets have the hit and run war doctrine as well as a trickster admiral. And that's in the spirit of fairness to keep the test fair for both fleets. Now, of course, you may get different results with slightly different situations in-game, but this is going to be a benchmark for how the different ships compare against each other and how they compete. So let's get into our ship designs and find out what we're going to be fighting with today. With our destroyers, we're going to be looking at two main designs and a single variation. Now, the main designs we'll be looking at is an artillery destroyer and an anti-corvette destroyer. So the artillery destroyer here, that's going to have a large and a medium slot. Now I put the plasma cannon, the plasma-based weapon, on a medium slot. So we've got a balance here between anti-shield and anti-armor weaponry. And then of course the plasma weapon is going to be dealing more damage to hull, which is going to be good and useful. But because these designs are going to be mainly focusing on shield defense, shield and crystal plating, as you've seen in some of my other videos, is a very effective way of defending your ships for cost effectiveness. So I'm going to focus on looking at that. And this means the anti-shield weapon is better to have in the large slot, dealing a higher damage output here. Of course, with cruisers, they've got quite low evasion, so I've gone with the artillery combat computer to increase my range and fire rate. Other than that, everything's at level 3 in terms of defense, or level 4 on some of my specific weapons. That's the 2230 kind of estimate I'm going here with. Now, a variation on this, I'm going to be swapping out the medium weapon and replacing it with flak cannons. Now, those flak cannons there on this kind of artillery picket, they're going to be really useful, hopefully, for taking on and taking down the fighters that the cruisers are going to bring to bear with their hangar calls. Now, they weren't very effective when I was testing with corvettes. When corvettes swapped over to have these picket slots, it didn't really help and actually hindered their overall damage output, and they didn't really stop as much damage from the cruisers. But hopefully here, with the destroyers, we are going to be doing better. And finally here, we're going to be looking at an anti-corvette destroyer. Now this is a destroyer, I've tweaked it a little bit to give it plasma cannons because they're going to be doing a little bit better against the cruisers, which do have high hull. But this is a design that should do quite well against corvettes. To be quite honest, you'd probably want to swap the plasma out for level 4 lasers with the higher accuracy and tracking against corvettes. But overall, that should do well there. Against these cruisers, we're just going to have to see, though I suspect it not to perform well. But I think it's good to include this so you can see if you have a fleet which is intended to fight corvettes, now we can see what's going to happen if they come across cruisers. I'm also going to be looking at the late version, so a late game version of these designs. Now, the only really important ones I need to show, which you can't just extrapolate out by including better and higher advanced levels on your weapons and defenses, are the changes to my large slots. I'm going to be changing large slots and swapping in the neutron launchers. As you probably know if you've seen some of my other videos, these are really fantastic weapons that are going to be dealing a high amount of damage. So for the late game versions, I'm going to be testing these designs. With the cruisers, I'm going to be having some differences here to the destroyers, so I'm going to have 3 main designs rather than 2, a carrier design, an artillery design, and something of a picket or anti-corvette design. First, we have the artillery cruisers. Now, they're going to have as many large slot weapons as I can fit on them. I think this is going to be a ship that does very well against the destroyers, but we're just going to have to wait and see. Now, I've also put a picket combat computer on here. That's going to boost my tracking, as the destroyers do have relatively high evasion. At the moment, they're around 50% in the 22-30 game, but in the late game that will go up. Of course, if you manage to get your hands on something quite rare like an enigmatic encoder, or you are psionic and get the psionic admiral, along with having possibly the bonus from the shroud, you could get that evasion really high up to 80 or 90%. But because that's not something you can reliably do, it's not something I'm going to be testing in this series. This is about what the average destroyer is going to be like for the average player in the average playthrough. Something of a variant on the artillery cruiser is going to be the carrier cruiser. So I've swapped out that artillery core for a hangar core. I put in the anti-missile point defense because I just had to put something in there. And I put in fighters. So this one I expect to do reasonably well. We've got artillery at the front. We've got some fighters which are going to negate any evasion the destroyers have. But overall, I think this could be quite neck and neck to the artillery design. Of course, I've also gone with the picket combat computer again to boost my tracking. And I've gone for as many shields really as I can kind of fit in here at the technology level. And then after that, a mixture of armor and crystal plating. And then we have the picket cruiser, or the anti-corvette cruiser. Now, this cruiser is one that I would say that you should use against the corvettes. You could also use the fighter cruiser, but this is going to do better if you come up against something like a gunship corvette, as I've shown in my videos in the cruisers versus corvette video. Of course, the medium weapons will also have reasonably high tracking, so this should do all right against the destroyers as well. It'll be interesting to see which one comes up on top, but we have a wide variety of designs here, so let's jump in and find out some results. If you've been enjoying this video and other videos on my channel, please consider subscribing. It will help get my videos out to other players like you. So at the very start, let's look at something I expect to be a pitiful matchup. We're going to test our anti-corvette destroyers against our artillery cruisers. What kind of results do we see here? Well, it is an overwhelming loss for the destroyers. Our destroyers here are going to be completely battered. Of course, when you include the war doctrines in the admiral, you will get some better results with the destroyers just in terms of your own losses. You'll be able to halve them down. But that doesn't mean you're going to win the engagement. That doesn't mean much. You're still taking massive casualties compared to the cruiser casualties. So if you've got a fleet of destroyers designed for fighting corvettes, do not let them ever get into combat with cruisers like these artillery cruisers. Here we have the artillery destroyers against the artillery cruisers. This is, I think, one of the better matchups here from destroyer lineup. We've got a really good destroyer, but we do also have quite a good cruiser. And I was somewhat surprised at the results we got here. So what did we get? Well, as you can see here, the cruisers dealt twice the casualties to the destroyers, and that's relative to the overall fleet power here. So actually, they were dealing somewhere in the region of 4 times the losses to our destroyer fleets. And even with war doctrines as well, which did bring the casualties down for your destroyers, it also brought the casualties down for cruisers as well. So overall here, you can see at the same tech level, so at the same level of tech with the same resources at your disposal, and with the same war doctrines and admirals, you're going to find that the destroyers are completely outclassed by your artillery cruisers. But what if we replace the medium slot with some picket slots? Does that help at all? And the answer is an emphatic no. That doesn't really improve the amount that you're dying, and it doesn't improve the casualties you're inflicting on the enemy. If anything else, it reduces it. So it's clear to see here that your destroyers with a large and 2 picket slots are going to be no match for artillery cruisers either. Well, how about a cruiser design which we expect to perform not as well as the others? That's our picket cruiser. Let's look at the best destroyer we have, the large medium slot destroyer. How did that fare? Well, At 2230, before the proton and neutron launchers that we're going to be having, they didn't do fantastically. They did lose all of their engagements, and not only that, they lost more casualties as a percentage of fleet power or economic cost, because actually in this case it's very similar, as compared to the cruisers. Now, when you included war doctrines, though, the casualty rate flattened for the destroyers, and actually we saw here that they only lost as many ships proportionally as the cruiser fleets did, though it is important to note they were forced to retreat. However, when you go to the late game, it looks like a much better picture for the destroyers. So here they've got neutron launchers as opposed to the cruisers, which don't, because they've only got medium slots. And really what we're seeing here is neutron launchers doing a phenomenal amount of damage. Casualty rates in the range of 50, 60, 70% there for the cruisers. The only problem here is that the destroyers still aren't winning. They're still being forced to retreat. They're still being pushed back by the cruisers. Yes, the cruiser losses are phenomenally high, but they are still able to win the engagement even without neutron launchers. Over a longer period of time, with economic warfare in place, that kind of thing, you're not going to be able to sustain these kind of casualties. But it's important to note what the results of a single battle are. I didn't include the graphs and data for the other destroyer designs against this picket ship because they actually just did worse. Initial testing showed they did worse. I didn't see any point trying to drill down further into it. So basically look at these graphs and just think worse. What happens when we look at the carrier cruiser though? So artillery destroyers should do well against these kinds of ships. We've got the right kind of weapons. They're going to go do high damage, and we've also got the right computers that we're going to be hitting well with reasonable accuracy and having no evasion really from the cruisers taking any kind of role here. So at the 2230 level, we had fairly even engagements between the two in terms of losses, though the destroyers did consistently take more losses than the cruisers. Of course, when you add in war doctrines, or you add in the hit and run war doctrine and the trickster admiral, you're reducing the losses dramatically, but actually the destroyers will be benefiting most from this reduction. Of course, when you add in neutron launchers, it changes things up quite a bit. Now we're looking at pretty equal losses for both sides. So what does that really mean? Well, that kind of means here that if you're running these carrier cruisers and you're coming up against destroyers in the late game with large medium weaponry, so with neutron launchers on them, you're going to be taking about as much damage as they're dishing out. It's going to be pretty even. You can see there's a little fluctuation here on some of the bars in the graph, but that's actually within error. That basically disappears. Well, we're against a carrier, so why don't we have some extra picket slots? Let's have some flak defenses. Let's kill those fighters. Well, what happens when we do that? As you can see here, it doesn't go well for the destroyers at all. We're looking at pretty equivalent losses for the destroyers. However, much fewer losses for the cruisers. So actually what we're seeing here is that the picket slots are less valuable than a medium slot that you're swapping out there. It's better to be doing damage than trying to reduce those carriers and their efficiency. It's simply that actually that our picket slots aren't working as well as we would like. Now, of course, I also did some testing where I had some destroyers with just picket slots. I haven't included that in the data because I only did some initial testing, and they basically had the floor completely wiped from them. They were completely annihilated. In the later game as well, you'll notice that we're no longer at this parity between destroyer and cruiser losses that we had when we had artillery destroyers versus carrier cruisers. Looking at this result in conjunction with the other results I had when testing out other ship variants, specifically when we were looking at picket slots against carrier type ships, it's quite clear that across the board it is better to swap out those picket weapons for something offensive when you're trying to fight fighters. It's simply not good enough to have picket slots on your ships. So from this I can comfortably say, don't run your picket slots. Actually swap them out, go for something offensive. So what does all this mean? Well, interestingly, apart from the little blip where we had our artillery destroyers against the picket cruisers, and even then they didn't win their engagements even though they were inflicting more casualties, it's quite clear that basically any type of cruiser will beat any type of destroyer if you have economic and technological parity with your enemy. So I can definitely say from this set of data that cruisers fundamentally beat destroyers on every field of combat. Now, of course, you can beat cruisers with destroyers. You need to have a better technology than your opponent. If you've got neutron launchers or proton launchers or kinetic artillery, you're going to have a much better time at it than if you don't have technology like that. But overall, it's simply not good enough to be trying to run your destroyers against cruisers without some form of advantage somewhere. And also, a bit tangential to the point of this video, but taking flaks does not work. Do not attempt to use flak at taking down carriers. It's simply ineffective. It's actually much better to have an equivalent weapon in those slots, to change your slots out and have something different.